All right, so this week's sermon is the second in a series called Step by Step, What the Church Might Learn from 12-Step Recovery. I don't have a whole lot of time here to go through all the reasons for this particular sermon, so if you're curious about it, you can contact me direct, or you can watch the full length sermon when it is posted. The text that we'll be looking at today is from 1 Peter 5, verses 1 through 7, and the principle that comes out of 12-Step Recovery that we're going to be looking at is called sponsorship. So, the first thing I'd like to do is point your attention to the fact that the Protestant movement, that Reformation, the breaking away from the Catholic Church, had a lot to do with distrust for clergy and the authoritarian structure and all of the intermediaries in between individual Christians and God. And furthermore, the tradition that I'm in, the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, we come from what's called the Stone Campbell movement or the Restorationist movement, a group of people that wanted to build and be church, much like the way that people were church in the first century or in the New Testament. And so they had this distrust for clergy and hierarchy, just like the people that came before them. And so they established these congregations, and the original idea was to have a co-equal group of lay elders or overseers, people that kind of provided the direction of the congregation. And then you would have deacons, who were a co-equal group of lay people who were the servants of the congregation, who went out into the world and fed the widows and provided visitation to those who were sick and elderly and so on and so forth. And then you would also have an evangelist, and the evangelist would be a lay person usually, or it could be a traveling person. But it was somebody that would come and bring the word. But they would not be elevated over the elders or the deacons. There was not to be any kind of clergy class of people. Now, what they found is that it just wasn't tenable, and for various reasons, they ended up kind of having clergy develop within that movement. And of course, we have clergy within our tradition today. So, what is that all about? Well, I think that there is a valid critique against clergy. And before I provide that, I do want to admit that, there's a reason that we have clergy. There are good things that clergy people provide. And after all, I wouldn't be doing this job if I didn't think that it was true. So let's just understand, first and foremost, clergy, are beneficial to a congregation in that they become theologically trained. So you have a person who, goes to seminary, spends a number of years thinking very, very, very deeply and reading all kinds of information and working out all of the kinks and finding all the places where things just don't work together and trying to find the way to iron those things out, to present a picture of the gospel that gives hope to people. And if you don't have good theological training, you can do a lot of spiritual damage. Trust me, I've seen cases where that is true. I've seen people who have been battered and they've been beaten by the weapon that was fashioned out of a perverse version of the gospel. And so it's important to have people who are theologically sophisticated and trained and who have studied the scriptures. Secondly, it's just, it's efficient for the organization. So you have a church institution or organization, a congregation or a denomination, what have you. And, if every decision was made by consensus of all the people, you'd never get anything done. So you have clergy who are trained in these kinds of things, and then you have a body of people who have the power, who provide the consent for certain things to happen, like you would in any kind of democracy. And you have, a group of people, whether they're elders or board members or whatever, that kind of put decisions together and then, get the consent of the congregation and then give it to the clergy to execute. And without that called professional class of people, it just wouldn't be very efficient. So you can understand the advantage of having that. And then finally, people are busy. They have lives and they need guidance. They need shepherding. And not everybody can show up when somebody's in need. And so they like to think that there's somebody that we can employ and they can go and do certain things on our behalf. Which brings me to what I think is the critique against clergy. So I would say that having a clergy class of people is not really good, or let's just say it's not optimal for disciples. So if you think about it, my job is to help facilitate a spiritual journey, but all too often that gets pulled into the attempt to do things over which I have no power to do. So specifically, I can't get on your knees and pray your prayers for you. I can't go out into the world and do the work that God has called and commissioned you to do. I cannot cultivate and build a relationship with your Redeemer, the one who died for your sins, the one who has this love, this deep love for you, the one that wants to know you and wants you to know him. I can't cultivate that relationship on your behalf. That takes your effort and your growth. And what happens is when you have a called class of clergy that sits above everyone else, then there's this idea that like they're more spiritual, more holy, or more qualified, and I don't have the ability to go on that path. I don't have the ability to cultivate a relationship, which is just not true. And it also gives people an easy way to abdicate their responsibility by just putting money in the plate. Now, we need, of course, resources to make this thing happen. I'm not saying stop giving or stop, giving resources and financial or otherwise. But what I am saying is it becomes an easy model through which we can abdicate our responsibility by paying somebody else to do it. And the problem is there's certain things you just can't pay me to do. If you gave me $1 million, I can't pray your prayers. Okay. The second thing is I don't think it's really good for the institution. It's not optimal for the institution. Let's just say that. Because the institution of church is meant to multiply. It's meant to grow, and it's meant to grow exponentially. And that's not only wide, meaning that we should have more expressions of the church in numbers across the globe, but also meant to grow in depth so that we have disciples who are equipped and qualified to go and to give good news and give hope to people who need hope in order to survive. And the model that we have is that, we train this special group of people, this small group of people to go and to become qualified in order to maintain churches and to go and plant new churches. So it's like, the expectation is that maybe in my, 10, 15, 20 years of ministry, that I could somehow make a connection with a young person and pour into them. And over the course of their growing up, that they discern a call by God, then they go off to seminary, then they become ordained, and then they get planted in a church, and then a bigger church, and then a bigger church, and then they decide church ain't for them, so they go plant a church or whatever. But that's a strategy that, in my mind, is putting a whole lot of eggs in a very small basket. It's not a very replicable, and it's not a very widespread strategy, if that's the right way of thinking about it. It certainly misses a whole lot of opportunities. So, lastly, I don't even know kind of how to say this, but I don't think a called class of clergy is good for clergy. I've become passionate about clergy self-care in the last couple of years because I've seen and I've experienced a little bit of the dangers and the risks that this profession has. And I can tell you and it breaks my heart, there are so many pastors, ministers, clergy people out there, people that I love dearly, people that other people love dearly, who are suffering greatly because of burnout, because of isolation, because of conflict, because of debt, because of all kinds of things. And it's a group of people that don't have an experience or they're not given the opportunities, I guess, to have good, healthy peer support because of the environment of church and because of all the differences in different denominations and theologies and dogmas and doctrines and so on and so forth. Sometimes when you try to get together with other clergy people and other, churches, it's almost like we're suspicious of each other or we're in competition with each other over scarce congregants. And it's just a bad situation. So we can become isolated. A lot of us don't have spiritual mentors because where the heck are you going to get one of those? A lot of us really neglect our physical health or our mental health or emotional health. And a lot of us neglect our spiritual health because after you've been studying the scriptures and you've been doing all of this Jesus work for, 50 hours a week and you go home, the last thing you want to do, but the thing you need to do most is pick up that Bible and read for yourself. To do those, to seek out your own spiritual connection. A lot of pastors haven't had the word preached to them. A lot of pastors haven't gone and experienced worship for themselves in the pews in a very long time. And I think that's a shame. And so I think the way that we have this whole thing modeled is really not that great for the people who answer that call. It's not ideal, at least. So what do we have instead? Well, in the letter, the first letter of Peter, in the 5th chapter, verses 1 through 7, we see Peter talking to a group of people he calls elders. Okay, so the whole letter that Peter writes, this first letter of Peter, is addressed to an entire congregation, all right? Bunch of people, whole community, okay? And in this whole community, we can discern that they were suffering greatly. That this is the people who have probably been persecuted, who have been suffering because of outside pressures, because of inside turmoil, because of differences of opinion, a lot of anxiety, a lot of fear, so on and so forth, lack of resources. And he's trying to give them encouragement. He's trying to teach them how to hang on and have hope. He tries to clarify the vision before them so they can remember what it is that they're following and what is the vision of God's kingdom that is soon to come. And so they're trying to hang on, and he's trying to give them something to hang on to, how to live their lives and so forth. Then he gets to the 5th chapter, and he says, now among all of you, the whole community, there are some elders. And to the elders, this is what I want you to do. As an elder myself, I now give you instruction because you have been witnesses to the sufferings of Christ, and because you have also, like me, been witnesses and expected to the glory that is to come, that you are to shepherd, to lead the people that are in your care. And you're to do so in 3 specific ways. Number 1, you need to do it humbly, which means it ain't about you. And you have to do so with a spirit that recognizes that you're just a human being and that you are ultimately led by the one who goes before you, and the one that goes before him, and the one that goes before her, and all the way back to Jesus. And you have to do so not only humbly, but you have to do so by example, which means the way that you lead is not to tell people what to do, but rather it's to live it in your character and in your day-to-day lives. And then finally, the way that you need to do this is not only humbly, it's not only by example, but is to be done willingly and not under a sense of obligation. And then he says to the young people, you need to follow these people. Now, it's clear why he would call this group out, right? They're elders, right? They've been around for a while, meaning they've been through some stuff. They've experienced heartache. They've experienced disappointment. They've experienced all kinds of suffering and persecution. They've been through some difficult things, and they have survived. They've held on to the gospel. They've held on to this vision. They've held on to their hope, and God has not disappointed. They are still there today. And so they have something to give. So it's natural that they are to lead by example, to show everyone else how to be, how to have hope, to pass along this wisdom so that the whole community might survive. And then he says to the young people, now follow these people, because one day, it's implied, you will be the elders, and it'll be your privilege to lead those who are in your care. Now, if I step back and I look at this, and I look at the way that Peter describes this church, I have to notice that nowhere in there does he say, now, I've talked to the whole community, I've talked to this subgroup of elders, now I want to talk to the pastor. Never comes up. Never says anything to anybody that we would consider a called clergy class. It just doesn't happen. If you go anywhere in the New Testament, you don't find people that seem to fit the profile of what we think of as ministers and pastors. He's always talking to groups of people and then subgroups within the group who have been around for a while, who have been called out of that group to lead in a special servant way. So I have to step back and say that doesn't look anything like our congregations today, right? I mean, if we examine the example that we have in 1 Peter and then look at our congregations, I'd say you don't see much of a matchup. But that actually does kind of resemble something that I see in 12-step recovery. Of course, we don't call them elders in 12-step recovery. We call them sponsors. Now, what's a sponsor? I'm just going to give you a brief definition. A sponsor is not somebody that vouches for you so you can get into a club. That's the way the word is used in other contexts. A sponsor really is like a mentor, a guide. Their primary job is to take you through the steps. But in the process of taking you through the steps, a special relationship of trust and confidence grows. And then you're able to turn to somebody in your time of need. You're able to seek advice from somebody that you know has your best interests at heart, that has not put any of themselves in their decisions about you, because they know what it's like to be you, and they genuinely care about you. We don't call them elders, we call them sponsors. So how did that come about? Well, I need to tell you a little story. And I know this little express sermon is going long, but it is what it is. So in the mid-1930s, there was a guy named Bill Wilson, one of the co-founders of Alcoholics Anonymous. And Bill Wilson has this spiritual experience during his last hospitalization for alcohol use. after a series of events, which I won't recount now. He has this bright flash of blinding light, and then he's experienced this transformation, and he comes out of there with a psychic change, if you will, and he's kind of a different person. So then he goes into the hospitals, the sanitariums, and the streets of New York. And he goes to every drunk he can find. And he tells them, he says, now listen, you need to get God, you need to get religion, you need to do what I've done, and you can be sober too. And he does this for months and months and months and months and months. And he goes out and puts himself in dangerous situations. He brings people into his house. He's doing all kinds of stuff. And here's the thing. None of those people that he reaches out to stay sober. None of them. So one day, he goes to his wife, Lois Wilson. And he says to Lois, I've been trying to pass this thing along to somebody, and nobody is staying sober. And right at that moment, the sobriety and the happiness of millions of people hung in the balance. And the 12-step recovery that was about to be formed almost didn't even happen. And as it was hanging in the balance on a thread, Lois said to Bill, you've stayed sober. And at that moment, he realized something that became the innovation that 12-step recovery has brought to the world. So, just so you know, the idea that alcoholism or addiction is a physical disease or a mental disease disorder was not new. That was not the innovation that 12-step recovery brought to the world. The idea that you need to have a spiritual experience, some kind of religious awakening in order to get sober, to have that personality change, that was not new. There's been all kinds of documentation of how those things have been observed in other people. Not very frequently, but it had been observed. The innovation that 12-step recovery has brought to the world is the idea of one drunk helping another. That's it. Because you see, if you take the person who is still drinking, right? You take the person who is still out there drinking or using drugs. Now, if that person's parent or spouse or sibling or child or friend or pastor or counselor or doctor comes to that person and says, listen, this is what you need to do, there is a fat chance that that person is going to do any of it. Because deep down, even if they believe that all of that stuff actually would work, they will not believe that it'll work for them. Because deep down inside every alcoholic or addict, I'm telling you, is this sense of uniqueness, this terminal uniqueness that puts up a wall between us and the rest of the world. And even though most of us don't even know it's there until we get into recovery, it's there. And so they believe, well, maybe it'll work, but it ain't going to work for me because my problems are different. My history is different. You see, I'm different. They won't do it. But then you have somebody come to them who has been where they've been, who has thought, felt, and believed the same way that they have. They can convince them and win the confidence that they know exactly what they're talking about because they've been literally in the exact same place. Suddenly, all of that information now has the possibility to save his or her life. And the reason is because that person can break down the wall of difference, that wall of uniqueness, and this person can come to believe, man, I'm not even sure if that stuff is going to work, but I do believe that this person I'm talking to knows what they're talking about because they've done the same stuff I've done. They've had the same thoughts that I've had. So I'm not even sure how it's going to work or if it's going to work, but I'm just going to trust because something clearly happened to them, and I really don't have anything better to do in the meantime. Now, if that wasn't good enough, and it is good enough. But if that wasn't good enough, there's also something that happens on this side, right? So you have the person who is still drinking, the person that's been sober for 6 months or a year or 5 years or 20 years. You have that second person. Now, from their perspective, the reason that this works is because now you have somebody that you can trust, that can bring you information that can save your life. But what about this perspective, okay? When people come to me and they ask me, what do you do to stay sober? How do you stay sober? I tell them the short answer is that you help other people stay sober. That's how you stay sober. The long answer is that in order to help people stay sober, you need to let somebody else help you stay sober. And you need somebody else to take you through the steps and teach you principles and give you experience and help you piece your life back together and facilitate this spiritual awakening that's going to happen in you. And when that spiritual awakening happens in you, then you will go and pass it on to somebody else. And you will help other people stay sober. And in helping others, you will stay sober for the rest of your life. Now, The interesting thing is that's independent of whether or not the person they're helping actually stays sober or not. That's the amazing thing. That's the amazing, gracious thing. That's what keeps people to not getting discouraged like Bill was almost discouraged. That keeps them going. And I think that's an amazing model for the church. What if everyone in the church realized that their own spiritual growth and sanity was contingent not only on having somebody lead and guide them, but also upon leading and guiding others? What if the church took this direction from 12-step recovery and we made it a part of our culture that the moment you entered this path, the moment that you began to follow Jesus, the moment that you fell to your knees and you said, I can't live this life anymore, I'm ready for something different, and there's something about that gospel that is calling my name, show me where to go. What if the moment that somebody came into this community, we paired them with somebody who has been there before. We paired them with an elder, a mentor, a sponsor, somebody that we could call a faith guide. I don't care what you call it. Elder's good enough. It's what the Bible uses. But every single person has an elder, an individual elder, somebody they can call in the middle of the night, somebody they can lean on for wisdom, somebody that they know cares about them and has no agenda except for their own goodwill, because they are humble, because it is a joy, because somebody else did it for them. And what if it was a part of our culture that not only does everyone have a mentor, an elder, a sponsor, a faith guide, but there would be this joy, this privilege, this opportunity to do that for other people. Now, to be honest with you, I don't think that would be too hard to do. If you could empower the people who are already qualified to give something away, to start giving that away, to start leading people on a journey, to start teaching people about faith, to start giving people hope, to take people along the path and tell them how to avoid the path that led nowhere. If you had people that were doing that, and as a result, there were individuals that had a spiritual awakening, let me tell you, you don't have to encourage those people to do anything. After the spiritual awakening, they will be so filled with God's goodness. They will be so filled with gratitude that you don't have to tell them to do anything. You can't stop them from doing stuff. And they will go out and spontaneously grab a hold of people and say, hey, you need a guide, you need an elder, you need a sponsor, you need a mentor. That's what I'm here for, because I can't keep this that I have. I can't keep this grace and this joy that I experience. I can't stay close to Jesus unless I show you how to stay close to Jesus. Can you imagine what that would be like? I've gone way too long in this sermon, so let me just finish by saying this. I think it would make my job obsolete. I think that you wouldn't need clergy, you wouldn't need pastors, because we would all be guiding ourselves right behind Jesus. We would be walking behind him, and we'd be walking right into the kingdom of God. And you wouldn't need people like me, because people would be empowered, and they would be edified, they would be educated, they would be encouraged, and they would be equipped about how to do the stuff that God calls us to do themselves. Worked in the first century, don't know why it can't work in the 21st century. And here's the beautiful thing. If that came to pass, then I'd get to worship with you. And I wouldn't have to stand up here, and I could just be one of y'all, and I could have an elder, and I could elder other people. And I tell you what, that sounds like the kingdom of heaven.